So Ashwin, you heard him, and as always, it has again been a very enriching and very fascinating experience listening to the group of people and his own personal recollection, as well as interaction with the top people in the Chinese establishment. So really learned a lot of things. We have some time for question and answers. You can really ask some questions.
Go ahead. Yes, you're a hawk, I can see.
So you mentioned that
he's good in all, man.
No. I've been put in this ID. Go ahead.
So you mentioned that Wang Lijian went to US embassy, US consulate, and US consulate apparently reported to the Hu administration regarding this.
No, US consulate reported to its headquarters, who I am told reported to Mr. Hu Jintao about what exactly Mr. Wang is communicating. So I think.
So does it mean that the current US administration is comfortable with Hu's administration coming to power rather than Jiang administration?
I think it's no secret that they are very happy President Obama won the election. They haven't kept it a secret. Mr. Romney was talking about currency manipulation and all kinds of things. And frankly, some of the positions taken by his party are positions which are very difficult to see outside a lunatic asylum. So I think the Chinese are extremely happy that Mr. Obama has come to power. Yes. I think the relationship is quite strong.
No, I was asking about the other way, whether the current US administration, is it supporting the Hu's faction, Hu-Shi faction, or the Jiang faction?
I don't believe that it's a question of supporting Jiang Zemin or Hu's faction. I simply think that it's if they did convey this information, it's an act of friendship. You would expect somebody who is in a friendly country to warn you if some monkey business is being planned by people. If tomorrow there's a coup attempt against India and the US has got an information, if they convey, it's a friendly gesture. It's obviously a friendly gesture. I don't think they were supporting any faction or the other. And I don't think any outsider can get involved in that kind of faction. If any outsider supports a faction, then that faction is going to be in trouble. But today there's no faction. Today Xi and Hu are running China. That faction is eliminated now, frankly. Now there's no factional problem. So a lot of the roiling that you saw in China the last 3 or 4 years, with this factional fighting, a complete paralysis in policy. There's been a complete paralysis in policy in China similar to what we're facing in India. And the reason was this factional fighting. I think that's over. So you're going to see a lot of initiatives vigorously pursued.
So the type of reports which are being in the US media completely ruin the political life of Bosila. So in that context, in a way, they were trying to damage the interest of Bosila as well as.
I don't think the US media, what was fed to the US media was that Boshila's wife was caught for killing some British guy. And that is a red herring in my view. It's no big deal. I mean, I don't want to be.
That carries a huge story of the first wife.
They jumped on the red herring and consumed it completely. That was a big deal. Yeah.
There's recently reports of Wen Jiabao's family fortunes. How does that factor in?
Well, if you ask me, my conspiratorial guess, and it's only a guess, is that somebody in the United States sent a message to the entire leadership of China: boys, we know where all your money is buried, and we have outed Mr. Wen Jiabao. If any of you guys go seriously out of line, we can out you as well. So I think that is a very, very clear message to the entire Chinese leadership that look here, boys, I mean there's no girls so far, it's all boys, that we know exactly where you've kept your dollars, so be careful. I think that was the reason for the leak. And anyway, I'd like to say the guy who wrote that story is in the United States, he hasn't come back to China. I tried to locate him. And the New York Times managing editor, Heidi Cow, was one of our guests, one of the many guests of Manipal. We have sent letters to all kinds of people. She's now managing editor of NYT. So I asked her what happened to this chap. She gave me a look and smiled. And that was it. No reply was there. But he's definitely not in China. Sorry. Yeah.
So what kind of political reforms can now we see in China with this regime in place? Also, one more question is that that Guangdong mayor, that is party secretary Wang Yang, he was supposedly assisting that Wukan village to help hold democratic elections. But he was also projected to be part of supposed to be a candidate for that standing committee of Politburo, but he didn't make it. So in this context, what do you say about the future of political reforms in China?
If I knew the answer to that question, I can assure you I'd be the most celebrated China expert in the world. So I am not the most celebrated, I would say, fairly high up in the list, but not the most celebrated. If I knew the answer, Anand, I promise you, I would have been a very happy man. I have no idea as to what's going to happen with political reform. One thing I'll tell you, the party wants to perpetuate itself in power. I am reasonably sure that in about 15 years' time, 16 years' time, the party will itself would democratize China. I've seen it happen in Taiwan. I've seen it happen in South Korea, where the ruling party itself makes the country a democracy. I think the same thing is going to happen in China. If at all China becomes a democracy, it's not going to be because of jasmine tea, it's not going to be because of any student agitation, it will be because the Communist Party democratized itself, like the Taiwanese democratized themselves, KMT and President Park in South Korea. Sorry.
So, considering that there have been factions in the past and there's a possibility they could maybe 10 years from now come up, how crucial is that 10-year period that the people in power have to bring about the reforms they want to? How crucial was that 10 years that either Jiang Zemin had or even Hu Jintao had? That period as compared to the 5 or 4 that democracies across the world have.
I think the Chinese people are very clear that they want their material lives to improve and they want more space for their spiritual lives. Today, if you go to China, you'll see a large number of Buddhist temples and even the church, etc. Lots of all kinds of, even Communist Party members have become are Buddhist and all that. So they have to succeed in having a good level of economic development. They have talked about doubling income rather than quadrupling it. I think they will go beyond that if they can really free the private sector in China. So, in the next 1 or 2 years will tell you by 2015 or so as to how successful they're going to be. I can't answer that question now. But their effort is going to be to once again raise growth in China to about 9% and to keep it at a floor of 7%. So that's going to be their effort.
If that target is not achieved, say within 2015 or something like that, is there a chance for another change in leadership before the 10-year period is out?
It's going to be, it's a huge bureaucracy. Do you know how many members the Communist Party of China has? Paid members, full-time members? Can you guess? 82.7 million people. I told you 657,000 of them were disciplined in the last 15 or 16 months. 657,000 is like an army. So that's the size of the party. It's a very centralized party. Very, very centralized. I find it's there in every village in China. It's all over the place. I find it very difficult to believe that it's a serious risk of losing power. Very difficult.
Why this time the numbers came down from 9 to 7? Any particular reason, or
it's much easier to take decisions in a 7-member group. At one time it was 5. During Jiang Zemin's time, because nobody trusted Jiang Zemin, they made it 7. Then Hu Jintao they trusted even less because Jiang Zemin didn't trust him, so he made it 9 and packed it with the majority of his own people. 5 of his people were Jiang Zemin people. So now they've gone back to 7 because it's easier to take decisions with 7 than with 9. Yeah.
So you mentioned the importance of economic.
I'm sorry.
So you mentioned about the role of economic relations in determining the bilateral relations between the nations. So contextualizing this in the case of Sino-Japanese relation, if I'm right, both the countries have had sufficiently strong economic relations over the years. But despite that, they've had very rocky political and diplomatic relations also. So how do you explain this? If economic relations can translate into good political relations, why is it not happening in the case of Japan?
You don't watch CCTV, unfortunately. About 6-7 days ago, I was interviewed on CCTV. So I was asked about Sino-Japanese relations. I said, as an Indian, I am very happy that both you guys are fighting each other. I would like to see you fight even more. Because the more you fight Japan, the more Japanese investment will come to India. So my sincere advice to you is, be as nasty to Japan as you can be. And I said this on CCTV 9, and I think my Chinese friends got it. Look, now in my view, Shinzo Abe is going to become the next Prime Minister. I'm not an expert in Japanese politics, but I think Mr. Abe is going to come. I'm very happy. Mr. Abe is a very good friend of India. He is he's got very many strong Indian friends. He's been to this country, he likes this country. But Shinzo Abe is supposed to be a hawk, but he's also a very pragmatic man. Personally, I think both Japanese and Chinese are pragmatic. I think a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing is going to happen. Like the Sino-Indian border, I mean, how many bullets have crossed the border across each other? Everybody writes about this terrible border, tension, this, that. And I don't know, 1986, Sundaram Chu, I don't know if any bullets flew. But the impression I have got from our people in Delhi, not a single bullet has been fired since 1962 in that border. So where is this high tension, high octane kind of border? So I'll be quite delighted if we have a kabuki dance between Japan and China. They will both scream at each other without bullets being fired. And as I told CCTV, for heaven's sake, please abuse the Japanese so that they can come to India in large numbers. Now we have, Mr. Tomko with us. We should have Japanese investment in India.
You're not answering a question. No, you said money, Chinese people.
Oh, why is Japan and China the same?
Yes, so it means India and China case, economic is not necessary to be,
Tomoko, I'll say that there are factions in China. Remember, the Jiang Zemin faction was stoking up nationalism as a means of coming to power. Through Bo Xilai, through the army newspaper, through bloggers. It was artificially fanning Chinese nationalism. One of the targets of that was Japan.
So the Sino-Japan relation is special, particular.
Exactly. Even today, there's one thing I'll say. If you go to China, for example, comic books. You look at the comic books. Most comic books are about some horrible Japanese people doing all kinds of terrible things. I'm not going to mention because we got a Japanese, one of our Japanese associates here. But you go to Chinese soap opera. Every one of the soap operas produced in China has got some nasty Japanese soldiers who kick people and hit them and whip them. And if I were a Chinese, I'd be terrified of going to Japan. I don't know how they all go to Japan in large numbers as tourists. Because according to these soap operas, every Japanese goes around with a whip. They all got boots, they kick people, they bite people, they do all kinds of terrible things. So the problem is the Chinese are trained from a very young age to believe like Pakistan. I've seen this in Pakistan. You see Pakistani textbooks. What they say about the people of India. You can't recognize the people of India from the textbooks in Pakistan. The same thing is happening in China. And I think it's a genie that they have created, which is a dangerous genie. Because China needs Japan. It needs Japanese technology, it needs Japanese investment. Japan needs China. Nobody in Asia can afford to delink ourselves from each other. If we can unitedly work for a good Asia, I think it's very important. So I think this genie has been created, but I do believe the leadership in China is smart enough to call a halt to it. Now that Jiang Zemin is now in retirement, and I think in Japan also, I don't see Mr. Abe ready to shoot. Because he is interested also in economic growth in Japan. So I think it's going to be like the India-China border. You've got dozens of seminars, conferences, and all kinds of papers about this extremely volatile border, where not a single bullet has been fired since 1962. So same thing is going to happen now. Fortunately, now it's going to shift from Sino-Indian border to Sino-Japanese island border. And what I'm told is there are approximately 600 goats on that island. I don't think there's any human being there. I'm told there are 600 goats. For the last 40 years, they've been trying to find oil there, and they haven't found oil in 40 years. Maybe in the next 40 days they'll find oil. But I don't know what the goats think. But I do think it's a pretty stupid dispute. We have to ask the goats.
Regarding economic growth and how it's equated by the party as its way of maintaining stability, because there's always this paranoia about popular uprisings because of lot of unemployment and all that, which drives the party to focus, especially Hu Jintao, to focus on the Malacca dilemma and what turns out to be a string of pearls in the Indian Ocean because of security of resources coming through. The question is, how is India ready? Because the other problem, other than the resources, is the markets, and the main markets is Europe and the US, who are sliding. And so how is India positioning to capitalize? Because logically, the only place to turn is to Asia itself.
Well, how is India capitalizing? I don't know what the government of India is thinking. I have not been able to understand the government of India and its policy for quite some time. But so far, the string of pearls is concerned. The Chinese are worried about the safety of their oil coming through the Malacca Straits into China. Now, they're very, very nervous about that. And they want to create enough assets so that nobody can block that oil coming to them and choke the Chinese economy.
Right.
So, in that sense, they are doing this basically. I don't think it's actually as a challenge to anybody, so much as a means of self-defense against a possible blockade.
Right.
So far as India is concerned, the Chinese are negative to India to the extent they perceive India will be a partner of the United States. It's not India qua India that the Chinese are opposed to. Because Japan is now a total US partner. Australia, even though it makes money from China, is a US partner. India is not in that boat. So they are worried India will become another Japan. 100% the US strategic partner. So they want to raise the cost to India of that kind of decision. They think if you become a strategic partner, we're going to impose a high cost on you. I think the main thing is basically to defend their economy against a blockade.
Right.
The so-called string of pearls is basically got the economic motive. I think the Chinese leadership is entirely driven by economics.
But they've been deciding to slow down the economy and
I don't
increase
think
it.
I don't think they're to slow down the economy. I think they've tried to damp down on inflation, and they've done that by trying to cut off money supply. But
Right.
it's not to slow down the economy. I think they'll be very nervous about it. They are very clear. 7% is the minimum. They can't go below 7%, and they'd like to go back to 9%. Sorry, anything else? Yeah.
Sir, can you tell us all about this concept that is coming in China? It's called People's Democracy, where in order to quell the rising need for democracy, at some regional levels they are experimenting with electing leaders at the first tier, as in something analogous to our panchayat. So that has been tried in different regions in China.
See, none of the people I met in China have ever discussed this very unique experiment with me. I've seen it in Western newspapers, but nobody whom I met in China. I meet serious people in China. I don't meet people who are non-serious. So unfortunately, no serious person has ever discussed this very fascinating concept with me. But as and when they do discuss it, I promise you I'll come back here and I'll tell you about it. As of now, I've been given no information whatsoever on this. One thing I will tell you, there are 600 to 80 million people in China who are on the internet. It's the largest internet community in the world. You have that Sina Weibo, you have that Chinese Twitter, you have the Youtube, which is their YouTube, and they're hugely on the internet. So clearly, in that sense, the genie's out of the bottle. You can't get it back again. You're not going to get the Chinese back and you can't have firewalls like that. So obviously, the party has to react. Now, how it reacts, I heard, for example, that there's going to be some election for some standing committee members. I don't know how they were chosen, how these guys were chosen. It could be that there was an election and the Wuxi people realized that they'll win the election hands down. So it could be that was a way of basically getting 7 people who are all Wuxi by forcing the election and the Jiang people losing the election. So it becomes a legitimate. I don't know how this 7 was selected. But these are very arcane matters which frankly none of us have any real idea about. So for me to give a judgment on that, I'm afraid I have not been, I don't have any idea about that kind of thing, nor has it ever been discussed before.
So you said that the relations between India and China would, strengthen if in case of trade. Do you think that relationship would translate to the region per se, Southern Asian region, or even in case of Sino-Pak partnership? Do you think that will affect?
You see, Jasdeep made a very important point which I hope everybody understood about Afghanistan. The Chinese are turning to India and Afghanistan because Pakistan is collapsing. It's no longer delivering. It's no longer giving them any benefit. They are into cost benefit. They pay a cost, they want a benefit. They are traders. And there's no very little benefit coming from Pakistan, there's only cost. So in that situation, automatically this kind of situation is taking place. So far as the periphery of India is concerned, the Chinese today are the #1 power in Sri Lanka. They are the #1 power in Bangladesh. They are very close to dislodging India as the #1 power in Nepal. They are already the #1 power in Pakistan. I think the Americans are only second. We are nowhere in the picture. So they have definitely expanded themselves in the periphery. But the core motivation is not really India. It is the India-specific extent of raising the cost for India of joining the Americans the way Japanese have joined. They don't want India to be a second Japan. The main target is, as Arvind very correctly said, and Jasdeep very, very correctly repeated many times, is the United States. The Chinese are competing with America. So they left India far behind. Let's not have this big illusion that they are worried about us. They are not. We are now 1/4 of the economy that they have. When in 1949, when China was formed, it was half the size of India economically. Even after the British had completely wiped us out, the Chinese had wiped themselves out even more. Today they are 4 times bigger than we. So they're not really, they don't see us as a threat the way we are looking at trying to.
So, the students, all of you would agree that as always, it has really been a great enriching and learning experience. We have really learned a lot of things, and his personal recollection, his interaction with the key people of the decision-making system in China. So please join me in thanking for